The judge's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the wooden desk. For a moment, no one breathed. My father let out a low chuckle behind me, the kind he used when he thought something was amusing, but not worth his full attention. My mother sighed and shook her head softly, already embarrassed on my behalf. I felt it without turning around. Then the judge leaned forward, his hand visibly trembling as he whispered, just loud enough for the front row to hear. My God, is that really her? That was the exact moment the courtroom changed. Chairs creaked, necks twisted, conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward me as I stood there in my uniform spine, straight hands at my sides, expression calm. I had walked into plenty of rooms like this before briefing, rooms command tents, makeshift courtrooms, overseas, but never one filled with people who thought they knew me. Nobody in that room knew who I really was, not until that day. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to know how little they'd always expected of me. I grew up in a quiet Midwestern town where people believed in church on Sundays' potluck dinners and clear lines between men's work and women's work. My parents were good people by most standards, hard-working, law-abiding, proud of appearances. My father spent his life in construction. My mother stayed home until my brother and I were older, then worked part-time at the county clerk's office. My brother Daniel was the center of their universe. He was smart, charming, and loud about it. The kind of boy teachers praised and neighbors bragged about. When he decided he wanted to go to college, my parents dipped into savings without hesitation. When he changed majors twice, they said he was finding himself. When he needed help with rent, my father wrote checks and never mentioned them again. I was the quiet one. I did well in school, but I didn't shine. I didn't ask for much. When I told my parents at 18 that I planned to enlist in the military, my father stared at me like I'd announced I was joining a traveling circus. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "That's no life for a woman." My mother tried to soften it. "It's just a phase," she said. "You'll get it out of your system." They didn't come to my enlistment ceremony. My brother had a study group that day. Over the years, I learned not to correct them. Whenever I came home on leave, my father would introduce me to neighbors as our daughter. She's, still in the Army. My mother worried I'd never marry, never settle down, never be taken care of. They assumed I followed orders, kept my head down, and waited for my life to start. In a way, they were right about one thing. I did keep my head down, but not because I was small, because I was focused. I served quietly. I stayed longer than most. I trained harder. I learned things I never talked about over dinner. I didn't post photos. I didn't tell stories. I believed deeply that service wasn't something you performed for applause. Over time, the distance between my parents and me grew not from anger, but from misunderstanding. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. I stopped correcting my brother when he joked about me playing soldier. Then came the call. It was my mother, her voice tight with worry. Daniel was in trouble, serious trouble, something involving property deals, veterans' benefits, and federal oversight. She didn't understand the details, only that there was a court date, and it was bad. "He's under so much stress," she said. "It would mean a lot if you came, just to show support." Support! She didn't ask if I could help. She didn't ask what I did now. She just assumed I'd sit quietly in the back, like always. I told her I'd be there. What I didn't tell her was why. The night before the hearing, I laid my uniform out with the same care I always did. Pressed, precise, insignia aligned exactly where they belonged. Not for drama, not for revenge. Because if I was going to step into that courtroom, I was going to do it honestly. That morning, the courthouse smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. My parents were already seated when I arrived. My father glanced up, saw me, and smirked. "You didn't have to dress up," he muttered. "It's just a hearing." I nodded once and kept walking. When I entered the courtroom, I felt the shift before I saw it. The bailiff straightened. The attorneys paused. And then the judge looked up. He knew. I recognized it instantly, the look of recognition mixed with disbelief. His hand froze mid-motion. That was when he whispered those words that changed everything. "My God, is that really her?" Behind me, my father stopped chuckling. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. This wasn't just about a case. It was about years of being unseen. And I was done being invisible. The judge called for a short recess. His voice careful, controlled, but no longer casual. People began whispering the moment his gavel tapped the desk. I stayed where I was, eyes forward, hands still. Years of training had taught me how to exist inside tension without reacting to it. My parents didn't speak. My mother kept smoothing the front of her coat over and over as if trying to erase something she couldn't name. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, now the amusement gone. For the first time in my life, neither of them knew what to say to me. While the courtroom slowly emptied, my mind drifted somewhere else, back to the long road that had led me here. I enlisted just weeks after my 18th birthday. I still remember standing in line at the recruitment office, surrounded mostly by young men who talked too loudly about how tough they were. I didn't say much. I signed the papers, raised my right hand, and stepped into a life my parents never tried to understand. Boot camp stripped everything unnecessary away. Ego, comfort, excuses. I learned quickly that silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was control. I learned how to listen, how to observe, how to act only when action mattered. My first deployment came sooner than I expected. I won't share details, not because they're dramatic, but because they're not meant to be entertainment. What I can say is this: I learned responsibility early. I learned that mistakes had consequences far beyond embarrassment. I learned that leadership didn't always come with rank, and that trust was built slowly through consistency. Letters from home were rare. When they came, they were short. "Hope you're being careful. Your brother just got a promotion. Call when you can." They never asked what I did. I never volunteered it. As the years passed, my career took shape in ways even I hadn't fully planned. I showed aptitude in areas that required precision and discretion. I was selected for additional training, then more, then assignments that demanded not just physical endurance, but judgment. By my 30s, I wasn't just following orders anymore. I was helping write them. Still, when I came home on leave, nothing changed. At family gatherings, my brother held court at the dinner table. He talked about investments, connections, opportunities. My parents listened like disciples. When someone asked about me, my mother would smile politely and say, "She's still in the military." Still, as if time had stalled for me. Once during a holiday dinner, my brother laughed and said, "Must be nice not having to think too much. Just do what you're told." My father chuckled. My mother changed the subject. I said nothing. What they didn't know was that by then, my work required me to think constantly about systems, vulnerabilities, ethics. I'd sat in rooms where a single decision could ripple outward, affecting hundreds of lives. I'd learned how easily authority could be abused and how quietly it often was. I also learned something else, that corruption rarely looks dramatic. It looks ordinary. It hides behind paperwork and confidence. It relies on people assuming someone else is paying attention. That's how my brother slipped. Daniel always believed rules were flexible guidelines for other people. He talked his way through college, into jobs he wasn't qualified for, into circles that valued appearance over substance. When he discovered ways to exploit programs meant to help veterans, he didn't see harm. He saw opportunity. and my parents saw success. The irony was almost painful. By the time his name crossed my desk for the first time, I didn't recognize it immediately. It was buried in a larger pattern: irregularities, overlapping transactions, inconsistencies that suggested deliberate manipulation. Only when I followed the trail further did I realize who it was. My brother. I requested reassignment immediately, not out of fear, but principle. I believed in distance, objectivity, but the review board denied it. "You're the most qualified person to see this through," they told me, "and you've disclosed the conflict." So I stayed. I worked the case the same way I worked every other, methodically, quietly, without personal commentary. I let the evidence speak. I documented everything. I followed procedure to the letter. At night, alone in my apartment, I thought about my parents, about how proud they were of him, about how little they knew of either of us. When the court date was set, I didn't tell them why I would be there. I didn't think it would matter. I assumed I'd remain behind the scenes, as I always had. But the judge had insisted. "This court needs your presence," he said, "in uniform." That request stayed with me. As the courtroom filled again, after recess, I could feel the weight of years settling into place. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about accountability, about truth finally stepping into the light. My parents glanced at me now, uncertain, cautious. For the first time, they were looking at me, not past me. I met my mother's eyes briefly. She looked away. The bailiff called the room to order. And as everyone rose, I understood something with quiet clarity. Everything I had endured, the dismissals, the silence, the underestimation, had prepared me for this moment, not to strike back, but to stand firm. The long road of silent service had brought me here, and the truth was about to come out. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room. "All rise." Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood. I rose with them, slow and steady, the way I'd been trained. My uniform felt heavier than usual, not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented in that room. To most people there, it was just cloth and insignia. To the judge, it was a language he understood fluently. When he returned to the bench, his eyes found me immediately. "Please be seated," he said, then paused. His gaze lingered, careful, respectful. "Ms. Harris," he added quietly, using my last name with a precision that made my parents stiffen. They sat down slowly. I remained standing. The judge cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said, "there is a procedural matter this court must address." A murmur moved through the room. The attorneys exchanged glances. My brother shifted in his seat and leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something sharp and annoyed. He still hadn't looked at me. Not really. The judge adjusted his glasses, his hands no longer shaking, but still tense. "Ms. Harris," he said again, louder this time, "would you please step forward?" Every step I took toward the front of the courtroom felt measured, deliberate. I wasn't nervous. I'd walked into far more dangerous places than this. But there was a different kind of weight here, the weight of being seen at last. As I stopped beside the witness stand, the judge exhaled slowly. "For the record," he said, "please state your full name and current position." I spoke clearly, evenly. "My name is Evelyn Harris. I am a commissioned officer in the United States military, currently assigned as a federal liaison overseeing compliance and investigative coordination related to this case." The words landed hard. The courtroom went still. I heard my mother gasp softly behind me. My father didn't make a sound at all. The judge nodded as if confirming something he'd already known. "Thank you," he said. "You may remain standing." He turned his attention to the room. For clarity, he continued, "Ms. Harris is not here today as a family member or character witness. She is here in an official capacity at the court's request." My brother's head snapped up. He stared at me, then really stared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by something closer to fear. "That's not," he began, but his attorney quickly placed a hand on his arm. The judge raised a hand. "You will have an opportunity to speak through counsel," he said calmly. "For now, you will listen." My parents sat frozen. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. My father's eyes moved between me and the judge, as if trying to reconcile two images that refused to align. The judge addressed the attorneys, next outlining adjustments to the proceedings, additional documentation, revised testimony, order, expanded jurisdiction. Each change carried weight. Each one made the situation clearer. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't going away. Throughout it all, I said nothing more. I didn't need to. My presence had already shifted the balance of the room. Years of quiet work, of careful documentation, and restraint had brought us here. When the judge finally called for opening statements, the air felt different, thicker, heavier. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the charges with calm precision. Fraud, misrepresentation, abuse of programs intended to support veterans. Each word struck like a measured blow. I watched my brother out of the corner of my eye. He fidgeted now, tapping his fingers against the table, his confidence draining with every sentence. This was not the casual negotiation he'd expected. This was real. Then it was the defense's turn. Daniel's lawyer cleared his throat, and began to speak of misunderstandings and technicalities, of intentions, of character. He gestured once vaguely toward my parents. But the room wasn't listening the way it had before. Too much had changed. When the judge called for the first witness, he glanced at me once more, just briefly. In that look, there was no triumph, only acknowledgement, respect. As testimony began, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not relief exactly, but acceptance. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally moving forward. Behind me, I sensed my parents' attention, like a physical presence. They weren't looking at a daughter who had disappointed them anymore. They were looking at a woman they didn't recognize. And for the first time, they were beginning to understand that their assumptions had cost them more than they realized. I stood silently, exactly where I belonged. The first witness finished speaking just after noon. By then, the courtroom felt less like a place of debate and more like a place of reckoning. The casual murmurs that usually floated through local hearings were gone. No one shifted in their seat without purpose. No one whispered. The truth had weight, and it was settling in. When the judge called my name, I stepped forward without hesitation. I placed my hand on the Bible, took the oath, and sat. The wooden chair felt solid beneath me, grounding. I had testified before many times, but never in a room where every word would echo into my own past. The prosecutor began gently establishing my background. Years of service, roles held, areas of responsibility. I answered plainly, without embellishment. Dates, titles, facts. Then came the evidence. I explained how the irregularities first appeared, small things easily dismissed if you weren't trained to notice patterns. Incomplete disclosures. Documents filed just late enough to avoid scrutiny. Claims tied to veteran programs that didn't align with eligibility requirements. As I spoke, I avoided looking at my brother. This wasn't personal testimony. It was professional. I described the process step by step, the safeguards meant to protect both individuals and public trust. I explained how the investigation expanded, how it crossed state lines, how federal oversight became unavoidable. The prosecutor asked, "In your professional opinion, were these actions accidental?" I paused not for drama, but for accuracy. No, I said. They were deliberate. A low ripple moved through the room. My brother leaned forward, whispering urgently to his lawyer. His face was pale now, the easy confidence replaced by something raw and unsettled. For the first time, he understood the scale of what he was facing. When the defense began their cross-examination, they tried a different approach. Ms. Harris, the attorney, said, pacing slowly, "Isn't it true that your relationship with the defendant is strained?" "It's distant," I replied, "not strained." "And isn't it possible," he continued, "that personal history could influence your interpretation of the facts?" I met his gaze calmly. "That's why I recused myself from initial review and followed all conflict disclosure protocols," I said. "Every conclusion presented here is supported by independent verification." The judge nodded slightly. The attorney pressed on, suggesting bias, suggesting motive. But the questions fell flat. I didn't rise to them. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I returned again and again to documentation, procedure, corroboration. Facts don't raise their voices. They don't need to. When my testimony concluded, the judge thanked me formally. I stepped down and returned to my seat, heart steady. Behind me, my mother's breathing sounded uneven. I didn't turn around, but I felt her struggle the collision between who she thought I was and who I clearly had become. The next witnesses only reinforced what had already been made clear. Financial experts, program administrators, paper trails unfolded one after another until there was nowhere left to hide. By the time closing statements approached the room, carried a quiet certainty. The judge leaned forward, hands folded. "This court will take a brief recess before ruling," he said. Outside the courtroom, no one spoke to me. Some nodded. A few avoided my eyes. My parents stood apart, whispering urgently to each other. My brother stayed seated, staring at the floor. When we were called back in, the judge didn't delay. "The evidence presented is clear," he said. "The court finds the defendant responsible on all applicable counts." My brother exhaled sharply, like the air had been knocked from him. My mother made a small broken sound. The judge continued outlining consequences, measured lawful, unavoidable, penalties, restitution, supervision. This wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. As the gavel fell, I felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet sadness for what could have been different if truth had mattered sooner. When court adjourned, people began to file out slowly. Conversations stayed hushed. My parents remained seated until the room was nearly empty. Finally, my father stood. He looked older than I remembered. He walked toward me, stopped a few feet away, and for a long moment said nothing at all. I didn't know he said finally. I nodded. "I know." It wasn't accusation. It wasn't forgiveness. Just truth standing plainly between us. The courtroom emptied in a way that felt heavier than when it had filled. People moved slowly, as if the weight of what they'd witnessed clung to their coats. I remained seated for a moment, after everyone else stood letting the quiet settle. I'd learned long ago that silence after impact is where reality takes hold. My brother was let out first. Not in handcuffs, not dramatically, just guided by an officer who spoke to him in a low, professional voice. Daniel didn't resist. He didn't argue. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders rounded, his gaze fixed on a spot just ahead of his feet. The man who once filled every room with confidence now couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I watched him go with a complicated ache in my chest. Despite everything, he was still my brother. Outside the courtroom, my parents stood near a bench by the windows, sunlight casting long lines across the floor. My mother's eyes were red. My father's hand shook slightly as he folded and unfolded a paper he hadn't read. They saw me approach and fell silent. "I didn't raise him to do this," my father said almost to himself. I stopped a few feet away. "I know," I replied. My mother looked at me, then really looked at me, as if seeing my face clearly for the first time in years. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. Her voice wasn't accusatory, just broken. I took a breath. "You never asked," I said gently. The words landed harder than I intended, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. We stood there for a moment, the three of us bound by history and regret. People passed by, murmuring about lunch plans, about work, about anything but what had just happened. Life, indifferent and relentless, kept moving. "I thought," my mother began, then stopped. "I thought you were just following orders." I nodded. "I was," I said. "But I was also making decisions, taking responsibility, protecting people you'll never meet." My father swallowed. "You always kept things to yourself." "I learned early that you didn't want to hear them," I replied. There was no bitterness in my voice, just clarity. They didn't argue. We walked out of the courthouse together, the late afternoon air cool against my face. Daniel was already gone, escorted to begin the consequences of choices he'd made, believing he was untouchable. That belief had cost him everything. In the days that followed, the news spread quietly through town. Not sensational headlines, just a brief article in the local paper. My parents received phone calls from relatives, from neighbors, who offered sympathy mixed with curiosity. For the first time, my brother wasn't the pride of the family. And for the first time, my service was mentioned with respect. But respect, I learned, can be a heavy thing when it arrives late. My parents visited me a week later. They sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone cold. The conversation was halting, careful, like learning a new language. "We failed you," my mother said finally. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't look away. "We didn't see you. We didn't listen." I folded my hands on the table. "I didn't need praise," I said. "I needed trust." My father nodded slowly. We measured success the wrong way. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower droned. Ordinary life pressed in, reminding us that reconciliation doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in quiet ones, over time, with honesty. "I can't undo what I did," my brother would say later, in a letter written from a place stripped of comfort and pretense. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just acknowledged reality. That mattered. I didn't respond right away. Not out of punishment, but reflection. Accountability had to come before healing. As the weeks passed, I returned to my work, my routines unchanged. But something inside me had shifted. The cost of arrogance, my brother's, my parents', even my own quiet acceptance had been paid in full. And now the work of understanding could begin. My parents came to see me on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of slow gray day that used to mean family dinners and forced small talk. This time felt different. There was no occasion to hide behind no crisis demanding urgency. Just three people finally willing to sit with the truth. My mother brought a pie. She always did when she didn't know what else to bring. Apple slightly overbaked around the edges. Familiar, comforting, heavy with meaning. We sat in my living room, the television off the windows, cracked open, just enough to let in the sound of distant traffic. My father cleared his throat more times than necessary. My mother kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I keep thinking about that courtroom," she said at last. "About the way we laughed, the way we looked at you." My father closed his eyes briefly. "I've never been more ashamed." I didn't rush to reassure them. This wasn't the moment for that. "You didn't laugh because you were cruel," I said slowly. "You laughed because you thought you understood me, and you never questioned that." My mother's shoulders sagged. "We thought success had a certain shape," she said. "College, money, recognition." "And noise," I added gently. She nodded, tears slipping free now. And noise. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I used to think if you didn't talk about your accomplishments, you didn't have any. I looked at him. In my world, I said the people who talk the least often carry the most. That landed somewhere deep. He pressed his lips together, fighting emotion he'd never been comfortable showing. I didn't know how to be proud of something I didn't understand, he admitted. That's fair, I said, but it doesn't excuse dismissing it. Silence stretched between us, not tense but necessary. I didn't tell you about my work, I continued, because every time I tried, it felt like I was speaking a language you didn't want to learn. My mother nodded. We made you feel small. You made me invisible, I corrected softly. That word changed something in the room. My parents exchanged a look that held decades of shared mistakes. Finally, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. I'm sorry, she said, not for misunderstanding your job, for misunderstanding you. My father followed, placing his hand over hers. You didn't need to prove anything, he said. We were the ones who needed to grow. I felt something loosen in my chest then. Not all at once, not magically, but enough to breathe easier. We talked for hours about my early years in service, about the moments I carried alone, about how pride, when left unchecked, can turn into blindness. They asked questions not to judge, but to learn. For the first time, I answered without guarding myself. We didn't talk much about my brother. His path was his own now. Consequences were part of his education, just as silence had been part of mine. Before they left, my father stood by the door and looked at me with a quiet seriousness I'd never seen before. You served with honor, he said, even when we didn't. That mattered more than any public recognition ever could. After they were gone, I sat alone and reflected on how many families never have this conversation. How many people measure worth by volume instead of value? How many quiet lives go unseen? Reconciliation, I realized, isn't about erasing the past. It's about finally telling the truth about it and choosing to move forward with humility. And for the first time, that felt possible. Life didn't change in any dramatic way after that conversation. There were no grand reunions, no public apologies, no sudden transformation into the family we might have been. What changed was quieter and more lasting. My parents began calling more often, not to give advice, not to check up on me, just to listen. Sometimes my mother would ask about my day, and I could hear her genuinely trying to understand the rhythms of a life she'd once dismissed. My father started sending newspaper clippings about veterans' issues, local stories about service members, notes scribbled in the margins, thought of you. It wasn't perfect. Healing rarely is at our age, but it was honest. My brother wrote again months later. His words were careful, stripped of excuses. He didn't ask me to intervene. He didn't ask for favors. He wrote about routine, about learning patience, about seeing the cost of shortcuts when there was nowhere left to run. I wrote back, not with forgiveness wrapped in ribbon, but with clarity. I told him accountability was the beginning, not the end. That dignity comes from owning what you've done, not outrunning it. That some lessons arrive late, but they still matter. That letter closed a chapter I never thought would end. I returned to my work, to early mornings, in long days, to quiet rooms where decisions are made without applause. I wore my uniform the same way I always had, not as armor, not as a statement, but as a reminder of responsibility. Sometimes, when I stood in line at the grocery store or walked past the courthouse downtown, no one recognized me. And that was fine. Honor was never meant to be loud. What stayed with me most wasn't the judge's reaction or the courtroom silence or even my parents' realization. It was the understanding that so many people, especially in this country, carry invisible weight. Teachers who shaped generations without praise. Nurses who held hands through final breaths. Veterans who came home and simply went back to work. Parents who sacrificed quietly. Neighbors who showed up without being asked. America is built on people like that. And too often, we don't see them until a moment forces us to stop and look. If there's anything I hope my story leaves you with, it's this: don't measure worth by noise. Don't assume quiet means small. And don't wait for a courtroom or a crisis or regret to finally ask someone who they really are. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones who never announce themselves. Nobody knew who I really was until that day. But I had always known. And now I live with that knowledge, not as revenge, but as peace. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of someone you overlooked or a moment you wish you'd handled differently, take a second to reflect. Share it with someone who values quiet strength. And if you believe stories like this still matter, consider staying with us for the next one. Some lessons are loud, but the ones that last are silent.